chapter 7. We're going to start in verse 20. So while you're turning there, a little update. Moses and Aaron have had their first meeting with Pharaoh, and the only thing that it produces is an unreasonable burden on the brick makers. And the Hebrew foremen then get their chance to make their case, and that doesn't get anywhere either, and it results in the Hebrews ended up rejecting Moses' leadership. And so Moses takes this problem to God, and they have a very long conversation about all this, and God reassures Moses that he has not forgotten them. And he reminds them of who he is, and through a series of I will statements, he tells them what he intends to do. And by the time God has done all this, everyone will then know who really is in charge. And so Moses goes to tell the Hebrew leadership of all this, but because of the recent events, they're still not on board. And so Moses then goes back to God and informs God that because of his failure, he is not worthy to be God's representative and lead his people. And in the midst of this conversation, we're given the genealogy of Moses and Aaron. And then following this, God informs Moses that he has reversed the roles of Moses and Pharaoh, that Moses will be God to Pharaoh rather than the other way around, as Pharaoh would have viewed it. And then when God has finally had enough of this conversation, he tells Moses and Aaron to stow it and get back to Pharaoh. And in this meeting, Moses and Aaron, for the first time, demonstrate the power of God that God has given them. And Moses Aaron's staff into a snake, but the court magicians are also able to do this. But Aaron's snake eats theirs and leaves them staffless and demonstrating who has the more power. But Pharaoh's not convinced, and he doesn't relent. And so back to God, and he tells Moses and Aaron what he intends to do next. And he's about to turn all the water in Egypt into blood. So, yeah.
I didn't understand what you said about Moses and Pharaoh reversing. What did you say?
I said that God swapped their roles. Because Pharaoh views himself as the God over all of Egypt. Okay? And God then says, no. He says, Moses, you're going to be God to Pharaoh. And so what he has done is he had flipped their roles.
Gotcha.
Okay? At least as far as God was concerned, Moses was God to Pharaoh, not the other way around.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so James, can we start with you? Read 20 through 25, please.
So Moses and Aaron did even as the Lord had commanded, and he lifted up the staff and struck the water that was in the Nile, in the sight of Pharaoh and in sight of all his servants, and all the water that was in the Nile was turned to blood. And the fish that were in the Nile died, and the Nile became foul, so that the Egyptians could not drink water from the Nile, and the blood was through all the land of Egypt. But the magicians of Egypt did the same with their secret arts, and Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he did not listen to them, as the Lord had said. Then Pharaoh turned and went into his house, with no concern even for this. So all the Egyptians dug around the Nile for water to drink, for they could not drink of the water of the Nile. And 7 days passed after the Lord had struck the Nile.
Here we have the actual bringing on of the first plague, and that's no surprise. It happens just the way God said it would. But Pharaoh's magicians are able to duplicate this event too. And it's puzzling to me how they were able to do this, since all the water had already been turned into blood, but I'm sure there's more to this than what had been recorded here. But we get some insight in the Hebrew. It says that the plague occurred in their streams, in their canals, and in their ponds and reservoirs. Now, from this we can make the case that the waters in the area of the Hebrews were not affected. And so the duplication by the Egyptians could have been to affect all the waters of the Hebrews that had not yet been bloodied. Now, it's kind of like you did this to us, we can do this to you. none of this has changed Pharaoh, and he still has a hard heart, and so he goes back into his house thinking nothing of it. And I think the implication of this might be that he just didn't care about the impact that this had had on the people. Yeah, that's just speculation.
You know, one thing that's interesting about this is to look at it, and that is, you know, any time that people have done something wrong and you get away with it, you just become more bold to do it again. And it's, you know, and you can apply it to a lot of things, whatever it is in life. To do something wrong, I didn't get caught or I got away with it, and therefore it's like, I'll do it again, and I may even do it more egregiously, whatever it was. And there's just this tendency to keep going down a path to the point where nobody can catch me. I can get away with it. It doesn't apply to me. And then finally the day of days come. But it's almost like, and what I'm likening is that progression to doing it more, I can get away with it, nobody's gonna catch me, is that hardening of a heart. It's like, I've proved a point that it's like, they can't touch me because they can make their claim, but every time they do, I can match it. Therefore, I don't care.
Yeah.
And it's almost like that process of that arrogance or that false confidence is like the hardening of a heart. And I just picture it that way. It's like, because every time you got something, I can do it too. So now, not only was I arrogant before, I might be even worse now. So anyway, I just figured that.
Good.
So in verse 24, what is that really? Mine says they dug along the Nile,
Yeah.
which is weird. It's like, well, if it's in the Nile,
Probably
it's right
dug-
by
I
it
would
too.
think dug wells.
Yeah, I'll touch
Oh,
on
okay.
that just a little bit.
Getting ahead of the story.
Yeah, well, that's okay, that's good. All right, okay, so we need to see what's really happening here. And to understand, we kind of need to think back to the slide presentation on Egypt. And you recall that in their creation story, the earth was in chaos, okay, represented by the water. And then the gods caused the dry land to appear, bringing order out of the chaos. And this order was both a concept and a goddess. The goddess Ma'at, you'll remember. And it was the will of the gods that Ma'at was to be maintained. And it was Pharaoh's job as a god and representative of the gods to the people to maintain Ma'at, to maintain order. Okay? And God said that he will bring judgment on the gods of Egypt. And one can associate one or more of their gods with each of these plagues. And we talked about that before. And with each of these plagues, God is destroying order and bringing chaos. He's clearly demonstrating superiority over these gods that don't really exist, okay, but they're represented by demons, as we said elsewhere. Okay, so there must have been a whole lot of demons because the Egyptians had a lot of gods, some 1,500 or so. And what God is doing is systematically destroying the religion of the Egyptians by reversing the actions of their gods. Order back to chaos. Okay? Right, two last things before we move on. Like Janny was talking about, we're told the Egyptians dug down along the Nile to find good water. Okay? And we're not told how successful this was, but it's possible to imagine that the plague only affected surface water, not groundwater. And so they had to dig down in order to find it. We also see that the Egyptians who dug for water, it was the Egyptians who dug for water. The Hebrews didn't dig for water. Okay? It's possible they didn't need to. Okay, so, and with that, what we are told that 7 days passed before God brings on the next plague. And this seems to imply that the plague lasted 7 days. And so, so if we go on to the next plague, which happens to be one of my personal favorites. So let's go to chapter 8. Nancy, you want to read 1 through 7?
Sure, I was just gonna comment that the Nile perch had died, having been over the Nile River. The Nile perch died back then too, so here they're dying again, and
Yeah, the Nile
like
perch.
Victoria, so.
Interesting.
Then the Lord said to Moses, "Go back to Pharaoh and announce to him, 'This is what the Lord says. Let my people go so they can worship me. If you refuse to let them go, I will send a plague of frogs across your entire land. The Nile River will swarm with frogs. They will come up out of the river and into your palace, even into your bedroom and onto your bed. They will enter the houses of your officials and your people. They will even jump into your ovens and your kneading bowls. Frogs will jump on you, your people, and all your officials. Then the Lord said to Moses, tell Aaron, raise the staff in your hand over all the rivers, canals, and ponds of Egypt, and bring up the frogs over all the land. So Aaron raised his hand over the waters of Egypt, and the frogs came up and covered the whole land. Do you want 7 too?
Yes, please,
But the magicians were able to do the same thing with their magic. They too caused the frogs to come up on the land of Egypt.
All right, here we have a mass migration of frogs from the Nile up into their homes. And frogs had been these cute little creatures as long as they were in the river, but not anymore. And this plague to me is almost comical. And I can just picture frogs everywhere, on your couch, on the kitchen counter, on your food, in your bed, in your hair, on your face when you're trying to sleep, croaking everywhere. It sounds funny to us, but it probably wasn't very funny to the Egyptians. Now, you'll notice that from verses 1 through 4, God is telling Moses what the next plague is going to be. And then he tells Moses to tell Aaron what to do, stretch out your staff. And then it jumps directly from instructing to doing. And there's no mention here of going to Pharaoh and making demands or of Pharaoh's refusal. So in the narrative, it could be that things are just being left out, and we're just left to assume that certain things are happening. And this is going to occur repeatedly here, often here in the plagues. Now the Egyptians had a frog goddess. Her name was Hecht, who was considered to be the giver of life and the goddess of childbirth. And this goddess could have been the target here. Now notice that the first 2 plagues have to do with the Nile. Remember, we've talked about this before. The Nile was life. And the goddess Hecht was the giver of life and childbirth. And you'll remember that a previous Pharaoh's planned to limit the male population of Hebrews by having the infants thrown into the Nile. A little payback maybe here, along with a display of superiority perhaps. But what we're intended to see is the inability of Pharaoh and the gods to maintain order, to maintain Ma'at. And first the bloody water, and now the frogs. Frogs everywhere is definitely disorder. Now, disorder and chaos is increasing and taking different forms, and we're going to see that in the rest of the plagues. And we're going to see that the magicians were able to duplicate this sign as well. And this is the 3rd and the last time that they're able to do this. And I'm unable to find a reason why they were able in this case and not the rest, but other than a demonstration of their powers, I don't know why they felt it necessary to add to the people's misery. It's already bad enough.
I know.
So, all right, let's read on. April, you want to read 8 through 15, please?
Then Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron and said, entreat the Lord that he may take away the frogs from me and from my people, and I will let the people go, that they may sacrifice to the Lord. And Moses said to Pharaoh, accept the honor of saying, when I shall intercede for you, for your servants, and for your people, to destroy the frogs from you in your homes, that they may remain in the river only. So he said, tomorrow. And he said, let it be according to your word, that you may know that there is no one like the Lord your God. And the frogs shall depart from you, from your houses, from your servants, and from your people. They shall remain in the river only. Then Moses and Aaron went out from Pharaoh and Moses. And Moses cried out to the Lord concerning the frogs which he had brought against Pharaoh. So the Lord did according to the word of Moses. And the frogs died out of the houses, out of the courtyards, and out of the fields. They gathered them together in heaps, and the land stank. And when Pharaoh saw that there was relief, he hardened his heart and did not heed them, as the Lord had said.
Following this double dose of misery, Pharaoh has evidently had enough of these frogs, and his request to have Moses plead with God for him, it indicates that his magicians are not able to get this to stop. And although they're able to duplicate this event, they really don't have complete mastery over it as God does. And Pharaoh is desperate enough to admit this. And as with the rest of the plagues, the stopping of the plagues are as much a sign of superiority as are the bringing of the plagues. And so Pharaoh attempts to cut a deal. And stop this and I'll let the Hebrews have their worship session. And so Moses agrees and he tells Pharaoh he'll give it a try. And by the way, when would you like me to do this? And I doubt that this is as much honoring Pharaoh, but as an additional demonstration of God's sovereignty. He can do this anytime he wants to. And Moses isn't the one doing it. And Moses conveys to Pharaoh the reason he's willing to do this, so that you may know that there is no one like Yahweh God. Now, remember, this is kind of God's theme through all of this. And so Moses adds that God will get the frogs out of the houses and away from the people. Now, notice here that when Pharaoh pleads with Moses, Moses answers Pharaoh directly, not through Aaron. And we'll see this increasingly as things progress here through these plagues. Now, perhaps Moses is becoming the man that God knew him to be to begin with. Now, and God does this with us too. Now, he takes us in steps to grow us into the people that he knows we can be. And you know, people who will serve in his kingdom far more than they thought they ever could. And now, think who you were 30 years ago, and who are you today?
Well, I wasn't born yet. So I see your point.
You know, but for the rest of us who can think back 30 years,
Oh, Matt, you remember being born 30 years ago?
but see, that is God working. That is God at work in your life. Who were you 30 years ago, and who are you now? Someday you'll be able to think back 30 years.
That's right.
Yeah.
There's that contemporary Christian song that says, I wish you could see me now. I'm not who I was.
Yeah.
And thank God for that.
Yes,
Thank
absolutely,
God.
absolutely. And I wouldn't want to be the person I was 30 years ago. So anyway, so Moses goes to God the next day and he makes his pitch, and apparently Pharaoh was in a hurry to get this done. And God agrees, but notice how God does this. He doesn't have the frogs retreat back into the Nile. But the frogs, he has the frogs leave the homes, leave the courtyard, leave the fields to die. And this requires the Egyptians to shovel the frogs into piles where they can rot and stink. A little lasting reminder, perhaps. I don't want to give Pharaoh any credit here, but I wonder if this was part of the reason why he reneged on the deal to let him go. But still, we see the condition of his heart. And this is the first mention that Pharaoh hardened his own heart. Now, the meaning of this, Harvey touched on this, the meaning of this is that Pharaoh's heart is growing heavier, and that he is more and more guilty when weighed against the standard of right and wrong, which you'll remember from the Book of the Dead was the weight of a feather. And the irony of this is, to the Egyptians, Pharaoh as a god could do no wrong. But God's going to prove that Pharaoh isn't really a god at all. Okay, let's read on. Rick, you want to read 16 through 19?
Then the Lord said to Moses, Tell Aaron, stretch out your staff and strike the dust to the ground, and throughout the land of Egypt the dust will become gnats. They did this, and when Aaron stretched out his hand with the staff and struck the dust to the ground, gnats came upon men and animals. All the dust throughout the land of Egypt became gnats. But when the magicians tried to produce gnats by the secret arts, they could not, and the gnats were on men and animals. The magician said to Pharaoh, This is the finger of God. But Pharaoh's heart was hard, and he would not listen, just as the Lord had said.
So this is plague number 3, the gnats. This is a rather brief narrative, the most brief of all the plagues. And again, there's no mention of going to Pharaoh and his rejection of this demand. And maybe it happened, maybe it didn't. We're kind of left on our own there. But But we see the pattern. God tells Moses, Moses tells Aaron, and Aaron does it. And this is interesting too, that this is the last time that Aaron is mentioned as taking part in the producing of the plagues. And as in raise your staff or strike anything. Okay? Not mentioned again. It's also the last time it's recorded that Aaron speaks to Pharaoh on Moses' behalf. Now, I don't know whether to take this as a maturation process in Moses or that it's just done for the sake of brevity here. I don't really know. But anyway, the word gnats here can be translated lice, or it could have been some other pesky bug. And I don't know which is worse, gnats or lice. I'm just thinking about lice.
Yeah. Itchy.
It's like, somebody mentions ticks.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, but anyway, lice was quite common in Egypt, and in those days, many, especially the higher ups in society, would shave their heads, including the women, and they would wear wigs. Now, one commentator here points out that plagues number 2, 3, and 4 are pests that come from the water, the land, and the air, respectively. And that's 3 parts of the ecosystem, and it's probably significant somehow, although I don't know what it is. And also possibly significant is that the gnats or lice, whatever they were coming from the dust. The first man was made from the dust of the earth, and to dust they're going to return to death. Now, in my mind, that's kind of a stretch, but that's what one commentator offered there. Now, something to point out in verse 17. We see it written that all the dust of the land became gnats. And if we took this literally, it would mean that every single speck of dust of the ground became a gnat. And that would have left Egypt with absolutely no dust whatsoever on the ground. It would have all been flying around as a gnat. Okay, now, one has to be careful when one says things like the Bible doesn't really say that, or it's not what it means, because you kind of get into dangerous territory. But I'm going to venture into some dangerous territory here. And if you think I shouldn't be there, that's okay with me. I respect that. But we need to understand that in the Hebrew mindset, they were at times given to hyperbole. And that's just a literary device in which exaggeration is used as emphasis. And we see that used in literature today. It was just a part of how they thought and how they understood this. So when we see words like all and every and none, we need to understand that this could be one of those times. Okay? Now, all and every could also mean to them a lot, or many, or most, or nearly all, in addition to the notion of totality. Okay? Now, I'm aware of the danger zone here, and I'll do my best to stay out of it, but I believe that this is an appropriate time to enter into it. Yes?
So during all the plagues, I've never heard one way or the other. Did the Hebrews still have to be producing bricks and gathering straw?
I'm expecting so.
Yeah,
Well,
there's no real talk about it.
no, there isn't. And you have to wonder how much the Hebrews knew about what was going on here.
Right,
What, did they see all of this? And what were they thinking?
right.
Yeah, what were they thinking by now? Yeah, it doesn't
And
say
were they
anything about
impacted
that.
with it?
Yeah,
Were they suffering along with the Egyptians?
well, that's a
Exactly.
good point, which we're gonna make here in a little bit.
Or maybe it helped him realize that Moses was God's leader.
It's very possible that their attitude about Moses could be changing.
Yeah.
Attitude about their God too, who apparently had abandoned them through all that 400 years.
Was there a goddess of gnats then?
Oh,
Yeah,
there's gods and goddesses of all of these things, and multiple ones even that you can point to. But
Wow.
I wasn't going to get into every single one of those. There's charts in your Bibles. You can look those up. But it is pretty interesting.
Hey Dad, I was just reading actually last night in Lois Berberg's book, Reading the Bible with Rabbi Jesus, and she was talking about this exact thing actually, and she was saying that her take on the fact that they were not able to reproduce this miracle, whereas they were able to reproduce the other ones, was that it was because something was created. And I thought that was an interesting take, that it was, because the making gnats out of dust is creating something, and was her take. I thought that was the best that I've heard yet, so
That's a
it was
good one.
interesting, yeah.
Absolutely.
And frogs had come from tadpoles, so it wasn't created.
Yeah, and they were from the river, and, you know, they were already there potentially, so, yeah.
Huh.
But I had read commentaries also and had gotten nowhere on this
Yeah.
topic, but I thought that was good.
Yeah, that's good. All right, so anyway, this whole idea about all and none or never, I don't mean to try to emphasize that here, but I think the real emphasis is on the fact that the magicians tried to duplicate this and they weren't able to. And they were unable to duplicate any of the rest of the plagues. And given that they could duplicate the snakes and the blood and the frogs, it's hard to understand why they couldn't do this, but they couldn't. And their conclusion was rightly that it was the finger of God. And this is significant because to the Egyptians, the finger of a deity represented something powerful. And it could be to bring about something that was either for good or for evil. And generally, the finger of a deity was something to be feared for its power. And the magicians now recognize for the first time here that they are under the attack of a hostile deity. And they and the Pharaoh are powerless against it. And this Yahweh is beginning to be acknowledged here. And they're worried about this. And we finish this plague off with the Pharaoh did not listen to them. He refused to heed the conclusion of his magicians. And because his heart was still hard. Now this is one stubborn guy. And he's not gonna give up his place. Okay, where are we? Edie, do you want to read? Can you read verses 20 to 24?
The Lord said to Moses, "Get up early in the morning and present yourself to Pharaoh. When you see him going to the water, tell him, 'This is what the Lord has said. Let my people go, so that they may worship me. But if you will not let my people go, then I will send swarms of flies against you, your officials, your people, and your houses. The Egyptian houses will swarm with flies, so that the land where you will live. But on that day I will give special treatment to the land of Goshen, where my people are living. No flies will be there. This way you will know that I, the Lord, am in the land. I will make a distinction between my people and your people. This is a sign will take place tomorrow.' And the Lord did this. Thick swarms of flies went to Pharaoh's palace and his officials' homes. Throughout Egypt, the land will be ruined because of the swarms of flies."
In this next plague, the flies, the confrontation occurred once again at the river. It's not known with certainty if these were actually flies, but likely something that swarms in the air. And this is the first time that it is stated that God has set a distinction between the Hebrews and the Egyptians. Okay? And on the first two verses in the instruction to Moses, God refers to my people and your people. The distinction is going to be maintained throughout the rest of the plagues here. Now, God says that he'll set apart an area where his people dwell, and there will be no swarms of flies there. And by making this division, it's going to reinforce what God has been trying to get the Pharaoh to admit. That Yahweh, the God of the Hebrews, is not only their God, but God of all the earth. And that includes the Egyptians as well. So flies everywhere. Flies in your face, flies in your mouth, up your nose, in your eyes, in your food. It would have been hard to breathe without sucking up flies. But there's no flies in Goshen. Now in our house, Candy is the queen of the flies. And she's in a perpetual state of war against flies. If it flies, it dies at our house. But I don't think even Candy, armed with her handheld battery-operated Dyson vacuum cleaner, even with her fierce determination to be a match for these swarms. Let's read on. Trevor, do you want to read 25 to
Question,
32?
Mike.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, do we make the assumption that the first plagues actually did impact the Egyptians or the Israelites?
That's a good question.
Because this is the first time that he actually mentions
That's
that
the first time
they're
mentioned.
not going to be affected.
Although it's kind of hinted at with the blood that perhaps it didn't impact them,
Mhm.
but it's not stated that, so we don't really know.
Yeah.
Yeah, but this is the first time it's actually mentioned. So you know, if you just go by what you read there, probably it impacted them as well. But from here on out, not.
Right.
But with the gnats, and it could just be my translation, first of all, it said the gnats throughout the whole land of Egypt, but then down below it says the gnats infested the entire land, covering the Egyptians and their animals. It didn't say the Hebrews at that time. So, I mean, like I said, it could be the translation, so it's hard
to know.
to tell one way or another on it.
Yeah, so I guess you just make up your own story.
But you know, to the Israelites, you know, regarding the Israelites, there's the other side of the coin on this, because as each one of these events hardened Pharaoh's hearts, hardened his heart, the other side to this is the unwinding of years and years of the hardness of the Israelites against God, or ignoring God, or insensitivity to God. Because as each one of these unfold, it's a gradual realization that Pharaoh isn't God, that our old God is now powerful, and that the leader that we rejected is now having authority. But it's not on the first pass. It's not even on the second pass. It's going to take 10 passes for the Israelites on the other side to get to a point where it's like, yeah, you're right. Because it's like, and I think sometimes it takes for, like, you know, I just think of my own life, God had to make multiple passes to unwind something in my life. It may have hardened somebody else. I don't know if that was the case, but it took that long. So it's just like, it took that much to harden Pharaoh's heart and how far he had to go, but it also is a demonstration of how much God had to unwind in the Israelites to get them to turn around.
Sure. And when you think of the
Which
Passover,
is pretty amazing,
yeah,
too.
when you think of the Passover, and they finally they just said,
Finally, it's
okay,
like-
I get it, we'll follow you out of here.
On the 10th pass, it's starting to land. It's like,
Yeah.
you know, I think I'm getting this.
Yeah, okay. Let's see. Yes, you already read, Trevor?
No, yes.
Oh, you did? Oh, okay.
Here, 25 through what?
Clear to the end of the chapter.
Okay. Then Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said, "Go sacrifice to your God within the country." But Moses said, "It would not be right to do that, because what we will sacrifice to the Lord our God is detestable to the Egyptians. If we sacrifice what the Egyptians detest in front of them, won't they stone us? We must go a distance of 3 days into the wilderness and sacrifice to the Lord our God as he instructs us." Pharaoh responded, "I will let you go and sacrifice to the Lord your God in the wilderness, but don't go very far. Make an appeal for me." "As soon as I leave you," Moses said, "I will appeal to the Lord, and tomorrow the swarms of flies will depart from Pharaoh, his officials, and his people. But Pharaoh must not act deceptively again by refusing to let the people go and sacrifice to the Lord." Then Moses left Pharaoh's presence and appealed to the Lord. The Lord did as Moses had said. He removed the swarms of flies from Pharaoh, his officials, and his people. Not one was left. But Pharaoh hardened his heart this time also and did not let the people go.
So Pharaoh calls Moses and Aaron back here, and he tries to bargain. And his first offer is to let the Hebrews make a sacrifice within the land. And Moses counters that with, that's not going to work, because our kind of sacrifices will be repulsive to your people. And besides that, we need to do it exactly the way he tells us to. And by now, the Pharaoh has seen what happens to people who don't obey God. So you would think that Pharaoh would have understood their desire to be obedient. Now, I'm speculating here again, but I think the Hebrews had not been making sacrifices these many years in Egypt,
Right.
these 400 years. And so, and you might remember from previous conversations that the Egyptians despised shepherds. And this may indicate why the sacrifices involving their flocks and herds would be abhorrent to them. I'm just guessing here. But Moses feared that their abhorrence might actually lead to violence against them. And Pharaoh apparently understands all this, so he makes a better offer. But Pharaoh still wants to be in control. And you go into the wilderness, but you can't go very far. And by the way, ask you God to get rid of these flies.
Sure.
And so, so Moses agrees to do this, but this time he doesn't offer to let Pharaoh pick the time. He just tells him when he's going to do it, tomorrow. And Moses is setting the time schedule. And he's not agreeing to the short travel distance, he's just agreeing to petition God. But notice Moses seems pretty confident how God's going to answer him. So when Moses prays, God does it, and he removes the flies, but true to the condition and character of his heart, Pharaoh again reneges on the deal. All right, on to chapter 9. Karen, you want to do 1 through 7, please?
Then the Lord said to Moses, "Go to Pharaoh and say to him, 'This is what the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, says. Let my people go so that they may worship me. If you refuse to let them go and continue to hold them back, the hand of the Lord will bring a terrible plague on your livestock in the field, on your horses, donkeys, and camels, and on your cattle, sheep, and goats. But the Lord will make a distinction between the livestock of Israel and that of Egypt, so that no animal belonging to the Israelites will die.' The Lord set a time and said, 'Tomorrow the Lord will do this in the land.' And the next day the Lord did it. All the livestock of the Egyptians died, but not one animal belonging to the Israelites died. Pharaoh investigated and found that not even one of the animals of the Israelites had died. Yet his heart was unyielding, and he would not let the people go."
Plague number 5, this is on the domestic animals, and if you're an animal lover, you aren't going to like this one. But God is God, and he gets to decide these things, we don't. And again, no mention of Aaron and no staff involved here. And again, this could be just an omission of the details, an abbreviated count, or it could be that Moses is being more and more involved in what's going on here. So Moses starts off once again that it is Yahweh who is making the demands, as if Pharaoh didn't know it by now. And this is the first time Moses mentions the hand of God in his demands. And this is something that Pharaoh would recognize, especially since he had already experienced it, and especially since Egyptian writing mentioned the hand of Pharaoh as an expression of Pharaoh's power. And here again we see God making a distinction between the people of Pharaoh and God's people. And this is the first of the plagues where God specifies in advance the death of a living thing. And previously it was just misery. It was just misery put on them. And this time it's going to really hit them. Their livestock are actually going to die. And the word here translated pestilence is different a word than plague. Now the pestilence here means a fatal disease. It's a disease of epidemic proportions, whereas the word translated plague could mean any kind of disaster. Okay? Now in verse 5, Moses tells Pharaoh that God will even set the time of these events, tomorrow. And note in verse 6, it says, all the livestock of the Egyptians died. And this is probably hyperbole again. And we're going to see why when we get to plague number 7. Okay? So after some disease wipes out all the livestock, Pharaoh sends out to Goshen, where the Hebrews were, to check this stuff out to see if what Moses said would happen really did. And in spite of this, Pharaoh doesn't relent, and the people of God are still stuck in the land. Now, again, we talked about this earlier. Does anyone really wonder the effect that this is having on the Hebrews? And like Harvey said, yeah, probably so. They're probably beginning to see gradually they're beginning to turn their opinion about who this God is And is Moses really the guy here?
I got a question for you. Is there a thought ever in the commentaries that Pharaoh was hoping they would follow their gods, not like go back to their old Hebrew god kind of thing? Because they knew that they had a different god.
Well,
But
but see,
now-
they were already worshiping the gods of the Egyptians.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So maybe, okay, gotcha.
Okay.
Mike, wouldn't this also have made a pretty big impact on the military might of Egypt? With all their chariots, if their horses
gosh,
were all
yeah.
dead,
Yeah, I hadn't thought of that. You
Yeah, I
bet.
hadn't either.
you know?
Yeah, there goes their tanks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
True.
Good, yeah. All right, 8 through 12. Matt, you want to read that?
Yeah. Then the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, take handfuls of soot from a furnace and have Moses toss it into the air in the presence of Pharaoh. It will become fine dust over the whole land of Egypt, and festering boils will break out on people and animals throughout the land. So they took soot from a furnace and stood before Pharaoh. Moses tossed it into the air, and festering boils broke out on people and animals. The magicians could not stand before Moses because of the boils that were on them and all of the Egyptians. But the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart and would not listen to Moses and Aaron, just as the Lord had said to Moses.
Now, this plague, number 6 here, the boils, there's no mention of any differentiation between the Egyptians and the Hebrews, although it does say that it came upon all the Egyptians, so it could have been the case that there was a distinction. Now, boils can also be translated as an ulcer or sore, so it's not absolutely certain what this was, but this is the first of the plagues directed against people physically. Now, this had to have been a bit disconcerting because it showed that this God of the Hebrews had the power to directly affect them, not just their environment or their animals. And this is now humans that are directly bearing the brunt of God's judgment. And he's ratcheting up the consequences of their disobedience. And apparently this is so painful that the magicians, when they were summoned by Pharaoh to stand with him before Moses, they were unable to do it. And the magicians are not only no longer able to reproduce the plagues or stop them, but it's now affecting them personally. And as for this ash from the kiln, there's kind of a guess here as to the significance. Now, it's unlikely there was anything about the ash medically that would cause the boils. This is probably symbolic here, but from the slide presentation, remember we saw this particular family in the slides that they sun-dried their bricks. But it's possible that at least some of the bricks in ancient Egypt were kiln-dried. And if this is true, it could relate to the slavery of brick making and possibly at the added burden of having to gather their own straw. But maybe a little payback here. Now, it doesn't mention whether or not this was a brick drying kiln, so all that could be for nothing. But finally, notice in verse 8, God directs Moses to throw the ash into the air, not Aaron. And I don't know if this is brevity again or if God's involving Moses more and more in the actual doing. But regardless of this, in the end, Pharaoh's heart is not changed. So let's move on. Dear, you want to read 13 through 17, please?
Okay. Then the Lord said to Moses, rise up early in the morning and stand before Pharaoh and say to him, thus says the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, let my people go that they may serve me. For this time I will send all my plagues on you and your servants and your people, so that you may know that there is no one like me in all the earth. For if by now I had put forth my hand and struck you and your people with pestilence, you would then have been cut off from the earth. But indeed, for this cause I have allowed you to remain, in order to show you my power, and in order to proclaim my name through all the earth. Still you exalt yourself against my people by not letting them go.
Oh, this is plague number 7, and the explanation and description of this plague will last clear until the end of this chapter. So it's a long one. It's perhaps understoring its significance. In this first part, God is going to do a lot of explaining to Pharaoh. And God wants to make sure before he sends the plague why he is doing what he's doing. And first he tells them, in order for you to know there is none like me in all the earth. And I will send this plague on you personally, your servants and your people. And in Hebrew, where it says on you personally, it literally says, I am about to send all my signs to your heart. And I think the meaning of this is that it's intended to really impact Pharaoh deep down to the core. And God wants Pharaoh to understand, you've seen what I can do. I killed all your livestock, and at any time I could have killed all of you. But God says, I haven't done that because I've raised you up for this exact purpose, that my name will be made known everywhere. And God has repeatedly told Pharaoh his name. It's Yahweh. But God's about to tighten the screws again, and it's going to get intense. And God offers one other reason that he's taking this drastic action. Is Pharaoh is still placing himself in a position of authority over God's people. And he still thinks he's God to the Hebrews. And he hasn't done what God has told him to do. And God is going to show Pharaoh that he isn't what he imagines himself to be. I think we'll stop there.